So the question tonight about emancipation, we're hearing about it, we know it's the anniversary, we've seen the movie. The question I have for both of these men is what's the impact? What difference does it make how we tell the story of emancipation? It's a seminal moment in our nation. But do we tell the story about a benevolent, committed group of individuals, right, who signed legislation and fought and made it happen? That's one of the pieces of the story. Do we tell the story of emancipation that was fought for, that was schemed for, that was worked for by African Americans themselves to make it happen? What difference does it make which story we tell?
I was going to defer to you. I think it makes all the difference in the world. I saw, maybe a majority of folks had seen the Lincoln movie. And I saw it opening night, and I actually get to talk to Spielberg and Goodwin when we were here in January, so I've been practicing on what I would say. Because the critique of historians is that this is just a gift that white people are giving to black people. And that was in the New York Times, and it's been all over the blogs. And so it's the major critique is that we finally have a chance to tell the story whole. And Richmond has been showing how you would do that, that it takes black and white people working together. And you get this wonderfully sensitive film with incredible portrayal of Abraham Lincoln and of Mary Todd Lincoln and Thaddeus Stevens, and bring all this to life. And the only African Americans who appear in it are kind of what feels to me like a forced set scene at the beginning, and then two servants basically is the entire story. And so I think that it suggests that even people of best intention and all the money in the world and excellent advice, and I know that people locally who advised them, I haven't had a chance to talk to them, I know that they were people of big hearts and broad understanding. What is it about the story, or what is it about the country that makes us want to tell it that way? So I think, just 6 weeks ago, this might have seemed a more academic enterprise, but now we have a movie that is going to win a bunch of Academy Awards that millions of people are going to see. We had a chance to reboot, tell it whole, and we've not. So, but it's not, Gods and Generals or, Gettysburg, something that's just flagrantly blind.
Mm-hmm.
So in many ways, this is sort of the national story. So I think it matters partly because this is, and I feel a little bit when people ask, what do you think? And it's like, and they want you to say how awesome it was. Did you find any mistakes? They think that's what historians do. His hair color is wrong. He would have said, well, actually, the Hollywood Reporter wrote me and said, would they actually have used the F word in the 19th century? And I said, yes, they have all the words that we didn't invent that with the internet, right? And so it's interesting that would seem that it doesn't even seem to be a problem to the reviews have not pointed out that. So I think it matters because now this is the news story that the country's telling itself about where this came. And we've talked about this before. If you have freedom merely as a gift that's handed to 4 million enslaved people by people who are not themselves enslaved, A, it's not true, and B, it drains a lot of the meaning and significance out of it. T and I don't know that we actually disagree about anything. I'm guessing that's not really fighting words to you. But I will say that's what historians have said and have talked among ourselves about what are we supposed to say about this. So I don't know.
I think there's relevance on both sides because I do feel that there was a struggle to do what was right. The challenge with the struggle, however, was the projection of a paternalistic gift that we have struggled with for years as African Americans. Everything is given to us, and as I looked at the movie, if we're using the movie as a
this is not to ruin it for everybody. Yeah. It still turns out with the 13th Amendment.
It really was more about the 13th Amendment than it was emancipation. But But there were individuals of goodwill struggling to do, I think, what was right. What was so surprising to me was Stevens did have an African American concubine, and whether there was some influence from her toward this issue was, if you read between the lines in the movie, it would suggest that. And when I had to go back and do some research and found out that he actually did have African American concubine. But the other side of it is that isn't lifted up is the contributions that African Americans played in their freedom. As you know, over 180, close to 200,000 African Americans volunteered to serve for the Union, to fight for the freedom of those of us that were in the South. So that was a major contribution that I think is overlooked. In addition to that, the many freed blacks that sacrificed and risked what they had to support the Underground Railroad. You know, we don't hear much about Mary Bowser. I've been doing a little research lately and still haven't gotten much depth, but there was William Jackson, who was basically a chauffeur for Jefferson Davis, who supposedly made some contribution. Davis, when we think about it, he had a rough inner circle since Mary Bowser served in his house, and of course Harriet Tubman. So these individuals that contributed through their own sacrifices, that story gets lost, and as we talk about, you know, the emancipation, and but on both sides, to me, there were sacrifices and contribution, because the men who stood up for this change also made a statement that was, you know, somewhat challenging.
Well, one of the great things about the movie is that it shows how many white Northern men were against this. Even in 1865, if you've heard me talk, I always use this, I apologize, but I point out that the same percentage of white Northern men voted for Abraham Lincoln in 1864 as had in 1860. 45% of white Northern men voted against Abraham Lincoln. After the Gettysburg Address, after the fall of Atlanta, after the fall of the Shenandoah Valley, and all of these things are happening. And I thought the movie, to actually show the virulent racism, is an important contribution, and it makes us realize that none of these things happen by default. So I told myself, okay, you gotta let the movie be what it is. It's long enough as it is, and it's really about how law gets made. But I think even if you grant that, there's one scene that should have been in the movie that's not. That's actually in the book from which this movie was drawn. And so I did a little bit of research. Being an academic, couldn't have more than two people in front of me without opening a big old fat book. But you remember, those of you who've seen it, the scene where Sally Field is talking with Thaddeus Stevens at the reception at the White House. And of course, it's really the executive mansion, and there's kind of a laugh that goes out in the audience where they walk out the front steps of the executive mansion here in Richmond and say, well, it's not far to Richmond. In the middle of the city right there. But at that same, a reception very close to this, there was this scene. Mary vowed to remain till morning rather than have the door closed on a single visitor. French estimated that Lincoln shook hands at the rate of 100 every 4 minutes. Frederick Douglass would always remember the events of that evening. Quote, on reaching the door, 2 policemen stationed there took me rudely by the arm and ordered me to stand back, for the directions were to admit no persons of my color. End quote. Douglass assured the officers, quote, there must be some mistake, for no such order could have emanated from President Lincoln, and that if he knew I was at the door, he would desire my admission. His assumption was later confirmed when he discovered there were no orders from Mr. Lincoln or from anyone else. They were simply complying with an old custom. The impasse continued for a few moments until Douglas recognized a gentleman going in and asked him to tell the president he was unable to gain entry. Minutes later, the word came back to admit Douglas. Quote, I walked into the spacious East Room amid a scene of elegance such as in this country I had never before witnessed. Douglas had no difficulty spotting Lincoln, who stood like a mountain pine high above the others, he recalled, in his grand simplicity and home-like beauty. Recognizing me, even before I reached him, he exclaimed so that all around could hear him, Here comes my friend Douglas. Taking me by the hand, he said, I am so glad to see you. I saw you in the crowd today listening to my inaugural address. How did you like it? Douglas was embarrassed to detain the present conversation when there were thousands waiting to shake hands, but Lincoln insisted. You must stop a little, Douglas. There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours. I want to know what you think of it. For a moment, these two remarkable men stood together amid the sea of faces. Lincoln knew that Douglas would speak his mind, just as he always had. Mr. Lincoln, Douglas said finally, that was a sacred effort. Lincoln's face lit with delight. I'm glad you liked it, he replied. Why wasn't that in the movie? Because what that shows is that Lincoln had been listening to Douglas all along. There would have been those 2,000 Union soldiers of African-American descent had Douglas not been pressing him. So that's what I can't figure. Even if you grant that it's really about a movie about how laws are made, about internal politics and all that. So that's kind of what I want to ask Spielberg. You know, you based the movie on 3 pages of this book. There was one more page that you could have had that was entirely honest. And so it's, just as you say, T, the struggles of the millions to press freedom needs to be told. But even within sort of the drawing room scenes of this movie, Frederick Douglass had been fighting that battle for a long time.
Yeah, that's one thing that I left the movie, as impressed as I was with a lot of what was shared. Really the first thing is, why wasn't Frederick Douglass in this movie?
It's not like Morgan Freeman couldn't have nailed that.
Right. I mean, because he played such a critical role. It did speak to Lincoln in his effort to do the right thing. Unfortunately, he wasn't a consultant to Spielberg when the movie was written. But he fought to do the right thing. The movie shared his struggle with trying to get to the place that he knew was the right place. But there were a lot of voices that he brought into the circle around this issue. And Frederick Douglass was a major voice because he spoke truth to the powers to be. And that's very important from an African-American standpoint of what real leadership is, what love for your country and your people are. That you are willing to speak truth to power. And that's what Frederick Douglass did as a contribution to emancipation and how it sort of played out, or how it should have played out.
What's so amazing is that we tend to forget Douglass opposed Lincoln's election the first time. He opposed the Republican Party as being watered down. That this is just going to, this is really a white man's party. This is really about keeping black people out of the territories. Lincoln had said that if you'd seal slavery in, that it would die of its own weight in about 5 generations, which would have been 1960, right? And so Douglass not only is spoken truth to power, he had relentlessly criticized him, right? But then he had the courage to turn around and say, after the Emancipation Proclamation and the call for troops, African-American troops, he said, no, I'm with you now. So, which I think also fits into the spirit of the movie, which is politics is about compromise and making things work and happen. You know, the other thing that I think is that I've learned during the sesquicentennial of recent scholarship is that the role that our city played in bringing emancipation. There's a very interesting book about the battle on the peninsula when McClellan is trying to take the city from the ocean. and starts marching up the peninsula to take the city. But they run into all these earthworks, and they come to realize that they're being dug by enslaved men at the end of a gun. And they also see the Confederates putting guns in the hands of enslaved men, and then guns at their head to make them do it. And so when all these boys from the north are actually dying in the malaria, you imagine what it's like trying to fight your way to Richmond on the peninsula in June and July with the mosquitoes and all this sort of stuff. And that they find that they're dying on earthworks that have been done by enslaved men. That happens very early in the war, but they also see at the same time that the very first moment that enslaved people have the chance to make themselves free, they are. So if the enslaved people here, where slavery actually began in this country, it begins to end. And that slavery, that work of those enslaved people becomes the reason that Lincoln can give for destroying slavery, because they are military aid to the enemy, but at the same time they see the hope demonstrated in all the black people making themselves free at the first opportunity. So I don't, as we think about telling, I'm jealous for our city. I want, the movie should have been about Lincoln coming here in July of '65 and walking among the free people. The one place he comes to see that. There's another movie to be made there. It's interesting you were talking about Thaddeus Stevens and his African-American companion. They had played a major role in earlier American cinema. Can anybody remember where else you'd seen that? Birth of a Nation. But the difference there is that had been the way to undercut his moral authority, to show, it's a... I don't know if it's a woman in blackface or not, because a lot of the black characters in Birth of a Nation are. But the whole thing was criticizing him, that it showed what a hypocrite he was. So it's interesting, too, now what an interracial relationship now sees a symbol of reconciliation. In 1915, it seemed a symbol of hypocrisy and so forth. So all this is a very windy way of saying it's the story America tells about itself and how the most important thing that ever happened in this country happened. It matters if we get it right and all the people on stage who made it happen. That's a short answer.
No, thank you. I mean, the importance of historical accuracy, I think we all know. How many people in here have grandchildren? Okay. What difference will it make to those children when they're told, emancipation happened, there's freedom now, it happened, and here's how it happened. Why is it necessary to build the whole picture? I mean, historical accuracy aside, and please excuse me, I think it's
no.
But is that enough? What else? Why should those children hear the whole story?
I'll go first on this one if I could. I'll tell you, one reason, which may not be what we're expecting, is that back in 2009, 2010, when we were talking about emancipation, I found that among African American friends, it was a tough sell at first, because even though you have watch night and that sort of tradition, the word emancipation sounds like a gift. It sounds like an act rather than something that people have seized, right? And so you found that actually there's a kind of erasure of that part of African American history by African Americans themselves, because if the only story is this is something the white people gave us, I know that's not true. So I don't want to hear about that. And so what I've been trying to do the last several years is find a language in which freedom and the struggle for it, which has been going on for centuries, just culminates in this. And that this is not a full freedom at itself. So we don't have a language to explain how this is something meaningful, which is another thing. You can't tell me freedom really mattered. There's all this poverty and segregation afterwards. Well, they can't sell your children. After it does matter, but trying to find a language to suggest how there can be change, but without exaggerating it. Like, hallelujah, I'm free, but how free? So the nation as a whole, and it goes back to Deanna's point, we don't have a language to explain the most important thing that ever happened in this country. Because what's the graduated language by which you can talk about a slavery that then becomes segregation? How much celebration is due? How can you talk about complete propertylessness, being property yourself, to abject poverty for generations? how much does it matter? So I think just finding the vocabulary to talk about something that happened 150 years ago, you might think that we would have found the words by now. We're not really much closer to it than we were before, because people are so of goodwill, are wary about ignoring all the limitations and the persistence of the injustice, that we can kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater and say, well, nothing real happened. And so that's another thing. So all that's a way of saying that, ironically, celebrating this event with sadness is a challenge that I don't know how to do.
In so many ways, I totally agree with you, but for me, being able to tell the story with some accuracy is critical. But part of the accuracy in telling the story is also about telling the dynamic shift that take place with emancipation. One of the things when we begin to talk about that shift, we move into the legacies of emancipation. But when you think of the shift, the progress that African Americans made within the first 10 years after being freed, after moving from bondage to freedom with little access to anything.
Or nothing but the shirt on your back.
And, and when they want to talk about pulling yourself up from your own bootstrings, there are so many powerful stories that can be told about African Americans and the entrepreneurship that we don't talk about anymore, the political power that is now is corrupting the African American community as it is in other places. But African Americans made some major strides.
It's completely invisible. The whole point of Reconstruction is invisible.
And it is lost.
Yep.
You know, and when we begin to talk about entrepreneurship with our young, it's a foreign language now when it was a norm. Mm-hmm. And if we don't, part of telling that story is about helping African American kids understand that this was your norm, not public assistance or getting a job instead of a career, or getting a job instead of owning a business. Those were norms for African Americans after coming out of bondage into freedom, and made many strides. There were more political leaders 10 years in the South, more political leaders in the South 10 years after slavery than there were up until maybe
than there were 100 years later.
400 years later, yeah.
That's right. I couldn't agree more. I had one other thing I want to read you. This is from a book that I edited for the American Library Association that having conversations around the country, thinking about the Civil War and Emancipation on the 150th anniversaries. And one of the things, it's a new document that we discovered from 1873 by a guy named John M. Washington. And if you'll excuse me a little bit to read it. January 1st, 1861, I was sent to Richmond, Virginia to be hired out. I had long desired to go to Richmond. I had been told by my friends it was a good place to make money for myself, and I wanted to go there. So I didn't coordinate this. This is the first day that so he's an enslaved man, but he's being hired out. And something people don't fully realize, you could come to Richmond and be hired out, still be a slave, and make money, right? So with a great many of old friends, I was placed in the care of Mr. Hay Holmes, a hiring agent, and on the cars, started to Richmond, where we arrived at 3 o'clock the same day. And I was hired to one Zattel, an eating saloon keeper. There was no liquors kept there. I lived with him 6 months when he sold the place to a man named Windlinger. Both of these men were low, mean, and coarse. They treated their servants cruelly, often whipping them themselves or sending them to the slave jail to be whipped, where it was done fearfully for 50 cents. I got along unusually well with both men. especially the latter. So you can hear something we don't think about. All these are immigrants who were slaveholders. You think about an outsourcing whipping. And so just a few paragraphs there, this changes a lot of people's idea of what slavery looked like. I was living there when the Southern slaveholders in open rebellion fired on Fort Sumter. Little did they think that they were firing the death knell of slavery, and little did I think that my deliverance was so near at hand. The firing of Fort Sumter occurred April 12, 1861, and from that time forward, Richmond became the seat of the rebellion. Thousands of troops were sent to Richmond from all parts of the South on their way to Washington. As they said, and so many troops of all description was landed there that it appeared to be an impossibility to us, colored people, that they could ever be conquered. So that's imagining, too, what this Richmond would have looked like with all these thousands of people. So then he talks about Bull Run, and he talks about it had become a well-known fact that slaves was daily making their escape into the Union lines. So at Christmas 1861, I left Richmond, having been provided with a pass and a fare to Fredericksburg, Virginia. We don't picture about slaves riding trains by themselves. So he's going to Fredericksburg. So I bid Mr. Windlinger and my fellow servants goodbye. They expected me back the 1st of January and can live with them another year. So then he gets a job as a steward at the Shakespeare House. My master was not much pleased when he heard of my intention to remain in Fredericksburg that year. He seemed to think I wanted to remain too near the Yankees, though he did not tell me these words. The war was getting hotter every day, and the Yankees had approached within a few miles of the town more than once. The latter part of February 1862, the Rebs began to withdraw their forces from the Aquia Creek Landing. And early in March, the Rebs began to fall back from the Potomac River. The town was now filled with rebel soldiers, and their outrageous and dastardly acts toward the colored people cannot be told. It became dangerous to be out at all of night, which is an important thing for people who'd like to imagine the Confederates were the best friends of the enslaved people. The whites was hastening their slaves off to safer places of refuge. A great many slave men were sent to the rebel army as drivers, cooks, hostlers, and anything else they could do. So then he was rented, and so then what he does is he says, in fact, I made them believe I was terribly afraid of the Yankees. My master was well satisfied at my apparent disposition and told me I was quite right, for if the Yankees were to catch me, they would send me to Cuba or cut my hands off or otherwise maltreat me. Of course, I pretended to believe all they said, but knew they were lying all the while. As soon as they told me when I had to start, I intended to conceal myself and wait the approach of the Yankees, and when once aligned, I intended to go to Detroit, Michigan, where I had an uncle. And then the very final paragraph. Other things happened. It's interesting. You should read it. He mentions the Union lines. Before morning, I had begun to feel like I had truly escaped from the hand of the slave master, and with the help of God, I never would be a slave no more. I felt for the first time in my life that I could now claim every cent that I should work for as my own. I began now to feel that life had a new joy awaiting me. I might now go and come when I pleased, so I would remain with the army until I got enough money to travel further north. This was the first night of my freedom. It was Good Friday. Indeed, the best Friday I'd ever seen. And that's 1873. He writes that for his children, and to remind that. And that had never been published, and found it, so it still has all that.
And these are the type stories that aren't told about the African Americans' willingness and desire to be free, their expectation, and open opportunities to walk in that freedom. We don't talk much about Fort Comfort, and once the Emancipation Proclamation was set into action, that close to 2,000 individuals made their way to Fort Comfort or Fort Monroe, because once they knew there was an out, they were headed.
It took them 2 whole weeks.
Yes.
From emancipation, from secession, 2 weeks we're there. So 250 years of slavery.
I just want to begin to open it up. If other people have questions, I just have appreciated this so much, but you may have some other questions for either or both that you'd like to see them.
Ed?
I'm going to talk about that period right after slavery, the Reconstruction period. And you talk about the entrepreneurship, but how much of that was because it was forced? They had no other choice.
No, it really wasn't. You would have had, in Jackson Ward,
Yes.
you would have had hundreds of businesses that people opened. Now, they had no choice because their choice was to work for white people for almost nothing, right? Their choice was I'd rather be here in my own community and my own initiative.
Mhm.
Now, white people won't buy and sell with us, so let's actually use that to our advantage. So that's the thing, is that, and one of the things that we can see has happened since 1965, segregation sustained the black business district.
Mhm.
Right.
Self-contained.
Right.
But that begins, one thing I would say, we're going to need to reimagine slavery if we're going to understand emancipation.
Right.
Because just as this little thing read, people imagine it being white people standing over black people with whips, right? Richmond shows what the future of slavery would have been, which is it would have been this, it's still slavery, but there is a degree of autonomy that allowed black people, this guy imagines, I can make a business. I already know it. I'm already can run a hotel, right? And I will now run one for colored customers, right? So what's amazing, really, is how quickly, with no access to real property at all, they're able to build a business district, and they start, we all know that Maggie Walker and the businesses. Why the bank emerged is because white people won't loan them money to buy their own businesses. So that begins almost instantly. Now, it is funny because it's kind of a little bit scrambled politically. Okay, that sounds like a Republican sort of, this is the natural spirit of entrepreneurism, right? You know, and all this. And those of us who are not Republicans are suspicious of that language. But as Tia is suggesting, ironically, it was a language of self-emancipation in many ways. But we don't really know how to talk about that. But anyway, we have a map that we made at UR of the black business district, and it shows by 1880 there were 300 or 400 black-owned businesses in Richmond, all on the other side of Broad Street.
and it's important to understand that everybody wasn't necessarily ready to be on their own.
Right.
Okay, so I don't want you to think that everybody was ready, but the thing that is talked about when we talk about slavery is plantations. But we don't always talk about, and Ed spoke of hiring out. There were a lot of African Americans that were hired out. Those individuals that were hired out were highly skilled, and they were highly skilled in areas that there was a demand for.
And that white people wouldn't do sometimes.
And
barbering, for example.
So the question of being forced still required a choice. Do I want to do this for myself or not? And many African Americans, it's almost like when I did work with inmates, I used to ask them this question. Do you want to get out of jail, or do you want to be free? Okay, everybody wanted to get out of jail. Okay, everybody didn't have the mindset to be free, and that's two totally different things. It's very similar. Everybody wanted to get out of slavery. Everybody may not have been prepared to run their own businesses, but those that did also needed help. And I think there was a wonderful support system, a support system that was shown by some free blacks toward others. So I believe the groundswell, if you will, for this spirit of entrepreneurship was there. And I think things grew. Even though everybody, when you look at those individuals who, and most blacks coming out of slavery weren't educated, weren't literate. So there were a multitude of different challenges. But some of them said, I would rather be in the wilderness because what I'm sleeping in on the plantation ain't much better than what I can build in the wilderness. So, stepping out also brings out of you what's in you. And I think part of that also came into play. They just knew we wasn't going back to jail, okay? So,
yeah, I think it's sort of amazing how quickly entrepreneurialism emerges, and also political savvy. It's like instantly, so white people had told themselves, well, we're the descendants of the Greeks and Romans and trained through our bloodlines to understand democracy. And black people instantly, hey, we got it. Here's how we do it. And so that was the other big affront. I do think it goes back to, in some ways, white people didn't mind black entrepreneurialism as much.
Right.
They did mind black political, right? And so that's the old debate, W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, and how the entrepreneurialism gained to have a bad rap is it seemed to be an unoffensive way, but in many ways, taking some, making money was also an affront.
Because if you also understand of the 4 million African Americans that were freed after the war ended, that was probably half of the population in the South. So from a political power standpoint, there was a lot of predominantly African American communities, and smart and bold enough to say, they're making decisions that's affecting us. Let me position or take advantage of the political power that we have. That's why there were so many African American elected officials right after, within 10 years, and of course after that, the Jim Crow laws.
Right, and it goes back to Cricket's question. Why didn't he get the story right? Nobody has embodied core American ideals and enacted them with the courage and success of African Americans after freedom.
Right after freedom.
You're so right. And that's just a forgotten story. And so if you're trying to claim to change the vocabulary to say, what is it you believe in? Well, who overcame every obstacle possible to do these things? So but then you don't want to tell a success story that suggests that somehow it was not terrible. So that's the reason it's right.
It is a challenge.
What else we got?
Something that has always been interesting to me is even during slavery, that whole opportunity to buy yourself out of slavery created an opportunity for many to find ways to earn. And so there were people already before the war who were already in the process of creating their own opportunities, their own wealth, buying their families out of slavery, and also the exposure that they had on the plantation, in town, being around people. You learn so much more. We talk about the power of word of mouth, but just standing in a room serving someone, just how much you learn. And so folks were being prepped to come out and become leaders.
And I agree with you, and yet I know people know the story of Henry Box Brown, and everybody's seen that money. But I don't know the details of that. Is that what led him to run away? Is he'd raised the money to buy his wife. And then he saw his wife and children marched in front of him in a slave car. So he'd done everything. He'd learned the lesson, saved the money. He'd done it several times, and then to lose that. And so I think, again, making slavery three-dimensional actually makes it all the more powerful to understand. I mean, nobody can imagine seeing your family that you'd raised enough money to set free, march them. So you're right. There have been thousands of free black people here at the time of the Civil War. They had no presence at all in our historic memory, right? It's black, white, slave, free. And I think you're exactly right. That's all blurred in a way. That's the product of generations of striving. What else we got?
Speak a little bit about how the sort of lived experience of family life changed after Emancipation and Henry Box Brown, and some of the stories we heard tonight challenge some of the mythology about sort of economic activity during Reconstruction and some of the myths that people have today. I'm curious about, I remember in graduate school 15, 20 years ago reading at some point that after the Civil War there was a very high proportion of two-parent families, intact families, and in fact the dissolution of the family has happened after deindustrialization, much later, and so just curious about sort of what family structure looked like.
Well, to start, there were no legally married enslaved people. there were some individuals married to free blacks, but there were, slaves couldn't be legally married because they weren't legally human. So that's one thing to kind of understand. But family was important, and family have always been important in the African American community. So I think one of the things that have always stuck with me, I guess 10, 15 years ago, we did some work in Philadelphia. We went to Bethany AME Church, which was the first church founded by Richard Allen. And when I went to the museum, they had this ledger. And in this ledger, they had the membership. It was close to 600 people, and believe it or not, almost 50% of them were males, and almost 50%, maybe 51, 52% were women. And then the other thing that stuck out to me was the number that were in Sunday school. There was like 240 women and 239 men. Strong, that's a statement of a strong family base. Now, I have my own theory that deals with the breakdown of the African American community, or family, I should say, because the other side of that coin was the exodus, or the migration of individuals of African American descent trying to get out of the South, moving to the Midwest, West, and the East Coast, and many of them had to leave their families to go and establish residency, if you will, get a job, and I believe that was the beginning of the breakdown of the family structure as it was. Because once you get to the North, sometimes things don't work out. There's a little bit of shame that comes in. Sometimes you get to the North and you meet somebody else. And all of a sudden, being free and able to do some things that you couldn't do cause you to forget what you left back. This is Turner, by the way. Philosophy behind what happened with the breakdown, but from the enslaved perspective, after slavery, there was a very strong nuclear and extended family in the African American community, because one thing slavery taught us was we had to stick together. And there was a strong bond, and that bond carried. But then, as Reconstruction kicked in and migration began to, some different things happened. So I don't know, Ed, if you want.
Yeah, it's important to remember that the same entrepreneurial spirit I was celebrating also is the corrosive influence here. I'd say too, the most important thing that happens is that black people are actually able finally to get away from white men in a way they never could before. And that it's widely commented on that black people are retreating into their own homes because of the generations of sexual violence. And so there's a much less interracial sexual relations after slavery than there was before. So that's one thing that protects the integrity. I agree with your general interpretation, T. It's that we can also begin to see the economy is pulling black men and black women apart in the South, because we tend to forget hundreds of thousands of people, African American people, left Virginia for Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Alabama, before the Great Migration, okay? Because there's nothing here, okay? And especially for men. For women, domestic work in the city is good, but there are not jobs for black men very much. Even the factories, the tobacco factories, employ women more. So you can start seeing that if you want a job, you got to go out into the farms and so forth. And so almost as soon as freedom comes, the economic forces, and we see that cities are heavily dominated by women, and that it becomes very hard to sustain the families in that regard. So that's a healthy corrective, that we don't get so taken up by business that we forget that that's the other side of it. So anyway, and I think you're right about what the Great Migration does, but and I think another particular passion I have is people tend to freeze Southern history. As if nothing happened here. It's like, okay, is it time for the civil rights movement yet, right? That striving that we saw throughout slavery never pauses for a minute throughout freedom, right? And that's why, there should be that plaque in the state capitol about the African American legislators, right? Where does that come from? And there's black congressmen from Virginia until 1901, okay? Until they make a new constitution to get rid of. So I worry, too, that we deprive Southern African Americans of a history.
But Virginians as well.
Exactly. And so people that come to Richmond, will look around, we'll go to the historic part of town in the Fan. And I said, no, these were built in the 20th century. Well, wasn't it all burned? Oh, no. This is all built on the first mass-produced commodity in America.
Yeah.
This is cigarette money. But we've just like we boil our history down into black, white, slave, free, we've also boiled it down into before war, after war, right? And of course, Monument Avenue helps conflate all of that.
Yeah.
So we need to pump some oxygen back into our history, give people a chance to move around and make their own histories for generations. Because otherwise, you can't explain where somebody like Doug Wilder or Barbara Johns comes from. Because unless you see people making their own history after emancipation, the civil rights struggle is impossible to imagine. It's black Southerners doing this. So that's another tension. If we make it all oppression, there's not enough room to maneuver to create the great moral revolution of American history. So it's trying to find a language for that. That's my theme for the whole
But that's the other, with the question that you raised and the response, also deal with some of those legacies that get buried in, trying to tell this history correct. Because when you deny the contribution of the African American, you also deny the truth to whites. So when you deny that truth, what you're also doing is you're perpetuating a lie. And we spend all of our lives trying to fix this lie that has been told so many times and so consistently that it's become the truth. And that's, as we fight this battle today, it's about correcting a lie that have been sold and bought as true.
And both sides.
Both sides suffer.
We're going to have one more question here.
Now we got all these questions.
Andrew had his hand.
Lily had
Not-
it.
when
It's okay.
Charles-
We'll try to get a quick answer so we can do two.
Okay.
All right.
My question is
I
about the obsession with having individual heroes. And so you see it with Lincoln. My son is 7 years old. He comes, he loves Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, blah, blah, blah. That's what he's learning in second grade. So then fast forward, Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks is an amazing, courageous woman, spontaneously decided to, not give up her seat. No, it's totally wrong. So, but that's easy. I'm just curious what your take is on that. I mean, I have my own thoughts, but it's so damaging.
Interested in your thoughts. I would say this, that it's easier to teach children, but even when we're adults, the best-selling history books and movies are all about great people. It drives me freaking crazy. That's why I would read the story of James Washington. But we haven't found a way to explain the history of everybody to everybody. We still want to hang in on Martin Luther King or John F. Kennedy, right, or Abraham Lincoln. So I remember I went to the Atlanta Olympics in 1996. They walked out with this big float to Martin Luther King, which is great. But if you didn't have any idea about segregation, you wouldn't know what did he do, and how could this city that they're celebrating him where did it come from? So I actually just wrote myself a note about this today. How do we democratize the subject of history? Okay? Now we include women and African Americans, people of different ethnicities, right? But we still feel like we have to reduce it to a story of an individual. And I don't know if I'm just fighting a natural human instinct toward a story, an individual, but there's lots of good people out there who can tell the stories. But we begin with our children. And the effect of it, ironically, is, well, unless you are a Rosa Parks, you don't make history. Unless you happen to be one of the who are chosen, right? You might as well just give up and wait for somebody to come along and do something. So I think it's actually very destructive.
Mm-hmm.
Really.
I have been thinking about this a while, and it's the 13th Amendment where, you know, they have the exception.
Yep.
And the exception is that slavery is abolished except for punishment when you are convicted of a crime. So to me, that leads to the re-enslavement.
Yep.
Because you can't get incarcerated people rights restored. So, you know, how do we, you know, really lift that conversation into, and I think it kind of feeds into what you're saying, Andrew, in terms of making a single, you know, my thing is, when we get this new knowledge, how do we run with the new knowledge and move it forward? You know, everybody to get an opportunity to have this conversation, I think has a responsibility and a duty to make sure that we are telling the inclusive information.
If the knowledge is about truth, so if that's the knowledge that you're talking about, then we have to just be honest about the truth, and the truth is a compilation of a lot of what we've talked about. We can talk about the passing of the 13th Amendment, the Emancipation, but when we leave out Reconstruction and its impact, we have still created a gap. And when we begin to talk about truth, part of truth to me is filling some of the gaps. Because truth should bring us understanding, and understanding should bring us enlightenment, and enlightenment should bring us a different approach to things. So if that becomes the process, then you will know, first of all, what you're fighting, because I think too often we end up fighting stuff and we really don't know what we're fighting. We'll know what we're fighting, and we'll know how to fight what we're fighting. That doesn't make this thing easy, but I think that's how I see the value of this, as you say, new knowledge can be used to, because when you don't know what you're fighting, you end up fighting the air.
Just shadowboxing.
You just shadowboxing, yes. And that's what we end up doing as a community, is I look at issues and I almost can always see we fighting the wrong thing. Yeah. Okay? And hopefully that can sort of help us create a process, and that understanding should help us to, okay, let's get this, this process can help us get some things straight.
The problem that doesn't have a history can't have a future.
Mm-hmm.
if there's not something that brought us to this point, it's not just is. It's not just a way. That's a phrase that I hate. That I hear all the time. It is what it is. Well, no, it is what it was, and it will be something else, right? And so I think the way to begin is let's take it apart, so that we can understand how we might put together better. So that's the way, and it begins with the parts or language, our words.
We actually do have, we're going to end at 7:30, so we do have another.
I just wanted to say that maybe this idea that we pick heroes or villains and we center history on personalities, particular personalities, is almost the way that we react to things that happen in the world now, in the sense that we can hear 5,000 people are being killed in some war,
Right.
but we can't really do anything with that information. When we see a picture of a parent with a dead child in his or her arms, then we say, oh my gosh, what's the story? And I think that there's something, I don't think it's good to just peg a whole series of events around a single person, but I think it's the way a lot of people tend to be able to process something.
I think you're exactly right, but we can peg a person who's not at the top of the social order, right? The parent cradling a dead child, our history is filled with those people,
Yes.
right? So our story, the reason I read that little thing about a completely anonymous guy, his story is as good as anybody else's, but we need to give them faces. I would say one thing for us to think about, there are very few faces and names in Richmond's history, right? We have a hard time naming people who are on statues.
And it's histories we don't tend to think of as the individual
Yeah,
regular person. It's
Exactly.
the general. It's the president. It's
but I think, there should be ways we can tell those stories. They have names, they have
What's this book you wrote, Enemies?
In the Presence of Mine
In the
Enemies.
Presence of My Enemies. When I read Ed's book, and I was aware of this. Sometimes you're aware of things and you don't grasp just how impactful. When I read your book, the thing that stuck out to me more than anything was the role the newspapers played in how things were played out. And we have to take a look at, what are the influences that that's impacting us, and begin to give some attention to them, because if this picture is telling the story, then this picture is influencing me. What are the motives behind this influence? Are they showing me this because they want me to see how bad it is? Are they showing me this so that I can have sympathy for this person or for this situation? Trying to understand intentions can really be important as we move forward in trying to do the work. And that gets lost sometimes when we are on this journey.
Everybody has stories.
We're going to go here and then over to Devon.
I'm very
Which town
intrigued by the idea that we don't have a language to talk about this in an appropriate way. And it seems to me that myths do have a function in society. So myths are never true, but they're never totally wrong either. And maybe that's a way of negotiating to some place where we might end up, right? And I have a different, when you talk about truth, it's kind of interesting. I think of William James, that truth is simply a way of confirming your prejudices, of marrying old facts to new opinion, is what he says. Right? So that means there are multiple truths in that sense, but not simply in being relativistic, but really in being how you were trained, what you were taught, and how you are confronting the evidence in front of you.
I'm a huge William James fan, and I think he would say that you can't test truth without evidence.
Right.
And what we're missing is the evidence of Richmond's history. We don't really have information with which to tell ourselves new stories, right? It's been, those stories have just been suppressed. Right? We have this great picture of Emancipation Day parade on Broad Street in 1901. That's huge. African American and white people sort of looking over the and now there's no memory that there was a time when African Americans thought it was important to celebrate emancipation, and they took over the city for that day. And everybody's dressed in their finery, and it's people of all ages. And so, you can't test what you think today if you don't have information.
Right. I'm just quickly, I was in California when the Rodney King things happened.
Yeah.
Here we have a video of a thing.
Right.
And two groups of people reach dramatically different conclusions
Yeah.
about what's happening.
That's what I'm talking
So,
about.
so
Intent.
even having the
How-
accurate description doesn't do it.
That way it gives you something to argue about.
Right.
In the absence of
Right.
there's no such thing as accuracy in history, but there are pieces of evidence that can generate a conversation. That's what we're missing here. We don't have anything to have a conversation with.
I do want to add that every January the 1st, there is an Emancipation Day celebration. It usually takes place in the African American Church. It usually is held on 5th Street, at 5th Baptist on Carey Street. So African Americans have been celebrating Emancipation Day for a long time. I do think as time have gone by, it has become a little more watered down. I don't know if it have the parade spirit that
Well, it's actually been
that
replaced.
picture.
And I'm sorry, I'm trying to pick a fight at some point in all this. People paying good money to sing a song. I'm sorry.
But whether it's gone into a different direction, it is still very relevant, and it's more in Richmond. I don't know that it is celebrated this way in any other city or.
Well, what I was interrupting you to say is that what's replaced emancipation is Juneteenth.
Yes.
And I think there are 44 states. Now, let's think about what that means. Juneteenth is when enslaved people of Texas supposedly heard of emancipation. And that's portrayed as a more authentically African American thing. But what that means is that it is still depriving African Americans of a central role in their own freedom, because now it's just saying it's 3 or 4 months after the war is over, they finally hear of it. It's not my place to come in and tell people that. And there's a national movement to do this. I've said repeatedly, why is there not a national holiday for the most important thing that ever happened in this country? The end of perpetual bondage for 4 million people.
Yes.
And if it wants to be Juneteenth, that's okay with me. But it's its own kind of, evasion in a way. And I don't know that it needs to be the day of the 13th Amendment. It could be the day that those 3 men went to Fort Monroe. But anyway, the point is that.
And your point is, I struggle with that because I am with Juneteenth, when you understand that, and if you're talking about maternalistic or paternalistic, I think his name was Granger, General Granger went to Galveston. He sort of freed the last enslaved group of African Americans in Galveston, Texas, and I wrestle with that. I understand, the significance of it. It does lose what I think are major contributions that African Americans made toward our freedom. But you're right, that is becoming.
But if it becomes, I'll be right behind it. I'll be celebrating.
And I also think it's important that it is celebrated. I think it's more important to have more than a good time behind it. You know, that's the issue for me. It should, and I lived in Texas, and I know it's always been a big day in Texas, and actually it's a state holiday in Texas. But it is about a celebration without the level of substance that emancipation should carry. And maybe it will revert back to that place as time, because it's only been celebrated in Virginia maybe the last 15 years. So it is still a very new toy. And it's a new toy for most of the 37 states that have, and I think you said 44, maybe 44.
I think just added 7.
Because I get stuff, I know the guy that's behind this.
I would defer to your.
Okay.
You're determined to beat me on this. I'm sorry.
Where's the scorekeeper?
But going back to what takes place here, every January 1st, there is a celebration of it through worship, and it keeps that truth alive.
Maybe
So
it deserves 2 holidays.
it does.
Yeah.
We gave enough.
One thing that strikes me, we talk about, and this is all kind of news to me. I'm sure, I know these things happen, but it's news to me. This is something that's really important.
Yes.
How many white people come to your church on the 1st of January to celebrate that?
Yes.
Just the members that I have that's white.
Okay.
So,
But if you wanted if it's so important, why don't you reach out to another? You gotta start somewhere. Reach out to a partner church that's mostly white.
well, I
And say, "Why don't we celebrate
give
this together?"
Cricket some credit for this. One of the things that I shouldn't say some credit, I should give her all the credit. She asked me though for permission, so I need to be sure that you know that she did the right thing.
At least once.
Ben leads a group of clergy that meet, and it's about 100 clergy of different denominations and races, and she sent him a letter or statement suggesting just that these African American church leaders invite European church to have fellowship with them this year. Don't know where that is, or where that's gone to at this point, but there's been a suggestion to do that. And if it's not this year, it is something that's probably that can be worked on to enhance the relationship building between African Americans and white congregations. So, Cricket, she hit something right this year.
Okay, your brother watches about twice a day. I want to bring this together simply because we've told people 7:30. I don't know how either of these fine gentlemen feel about staying longer. Certainly we're all welcome to, but I think it's fair to say it's been an extraordinary evening with the both of you leading it, and it's just been very moving and informative, and thank you from all of us. We don't, sometimes different ones of us talk about, we don't have a salon kind of experience in Richmond anymore. We can come together and have this, and I think this is a really powerful example of people coming together to care about this. We did, I think you were told when you came in, we did have it on We're trying out a new internet thing, so we got in touch with a couple of people to see if we could broadcast it. We're just trying to begin, and we don't want to tell you how to time because we're afraid you charge us. But we're trying to find a way, how do we share this? Because, Jack, I have many friends, some in this room, but they have many friends that I would just given anything if they'd been in here tonight. So many, because this was rich, and it was both of you just being right present for us. So, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank all of you.
Thank you, thank you.
Bye, TV Land.
I hope everyone has a